Well, what does Liverpool Football Club and the pandemic have in common? Keep listening and you'll find out as we go through. Today I'm thinking about the number of people in the last week or two who've used the word trapped to talk about how they feel. Sometimes they just said it in a throwaway line, I feel a bit trapped. Other people have said it with an incredible raw anguish, a kind of intensity. And I want to think about how Christians can cope with that raw intensity if they feel it, and how if we don't feel it, we can be supportive of others who feel, quote, trapped. Now, it's true that the longer this lockdown in the UK goes on, and it was announced this week that it's likely to go on till at least March the 8th, when schools may or may not start back. That's 6 weeks or so from now, and feels just overwhelming. So many people feel trapped now. Never mind how am I going to cope for the rest of January, the rest of February, and into March. It's going to feel very oppressive, and several people have responded to the announcement this week with not surprise, to be fair, but still with a kind of resigned angst about their life. And I've been reading the Psalms quite a bit, because if you Google deliverance and the concept of deliverance in the Psalms, you'll see quite a few Psalms talking about David feeling in a pit or trapped in some way, and God's being his deliverance. And I recommend the Psalms to you in this time of lockdown, because they do give a vocabulary to express our anger and our pain and our anguish, and still call us to godly living and to praise of God, even in these difficult circumstances. So people are talking about being trapped, and that does seem to be getting worse and worse. Let's explore for a moment why that is, and how we can transition, how we can help the government transition, how we can help ordinary people transition out of this sort of trappedness which they feel. Well, partly the elongation of lockdown policies makes people feel trapped, but the announcement, of course, of things like, the closing of the borders and people having to quarantine in hotels and people having to have a positive test before they can leave and a positive test before they come back, and the closing of the British border. People have said to me, I was trapped in my home, I couldn't go out, don't go out. And now I'm trapped in my country. It just feels like I'm trapped in a small prison at home, and the whole nation has become one great prison camp. I can't even leave the country. And of course, people are suspicious, because the government have continued to say that this policy was going to lead to success, and it clearly hasn't. The March lockdown, we've said this so many times before, didn't lead to freedom in the summer. The November lockdown didn't lead to a normal Christmas, and so on, and so on. And we even thought the vaccines were going to be successful. And now we're being told, no, even if you had the vaccine, you can't possibly go out, even if you had it. Because who knows, it's only 90% effective at best, maybe you're one of the 10%, and what if it doesn't stop you transmitting it to others? Oh, and gosh, there might be a variant. And so the vaccine, presented to us as the escape route, is now being presented as no such thing for so many. And so I can't tell you how many people have said to me how depressing it is to believe the vaccine was a way out of lockdown, and now to believe that's thrown into doubt. And even the prison of making our country a fortress, an island fortress, to keep out future variants. And the government do know, don't they, that the last variant came from Kent. Perhaps you should build a wall around Kent. Perhaps you should have a passport to get from Kent to Sussex. Perhaps every county should have a wall built around it to keep out a variant from another county in another town. I mean, it's just madness. It would never end. In fact, it's important to recognise the challenge of this. Wiser people than me have said a long time ago, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government programme. It's going to be pretty hard to get out of this, because there's always going to be variants. So might as well assume that our nation's going to be locked down to the world for the next 5 to 10 years. There are always going to be variants. And when they are, the vaccine in its current form won't be good enough for all of them. So we're going to have to begin the whole process all over again next year. And so, just like the flu jab, every year slightly different, so this jab slightly different every year. Vaccinating the whole country again every year. Gosh, what a mammoth thing. And these facts are making people feel trapped. There's no way out of this. Now, I've been thinking a lot about this from the biblical perspective, about people being trapped and in prison. And you think of the number of prison stories in the Bible. Think of Peter in prison in the New Testament. He's delivered ultimately by an angelic visitation that sets him free past all these guards. You know the story in Acts. And then the story in Genesis of Joseph, who quite unjustly is accused by Potiphar's wife, is thrown into jail, and frankly is never going to get out by due process or legal trial. He's just going to rot away there forever until two fellow royal court members are caught in a bit of a trap, and he interprets their dreams. And some while later, a long while later, years, not days or weeks, the Pharaoh hears about his dream interpreting skills, and he's dragged out of that. And through the miracle of his ability to interpret dreams, he's set free. And so it seems to me that throughout the Bible, many of the prison trapped stories need supernatural deliverance to set us free. They don't just escape by the fact that there's a retrial and they are pardoned and shown to be innocent, although that would be true if such a process were possible in Old and New Testament times. No, they need an act of God, a divine intervention to make a difference. And it's very clear to me that if we're going to get out of lockdown and into anything like the freedom and human flourishing that God longs for us to have as a world and as nations and as people, it is by divine intervention. And so I'm glad that the Archbishops of Canterbury and York have asked us from February the 1st to pray each evening. What a great thing that is. Please do join them or find another time to pray. But pray. I'm going to read some scriptures in a few minutes from Isaiah to fill us with faith as we cry to God to be our deliverer and our rescuer from lockdown. These massively secular times have assumed that lockdown or vaccines or something is going to set us free. And those who know and love Jesus are sure of this. The ultimate salvation still resides in divine intervention. So what do we need to be doing practically to prepare ourselves for getting out of lockdown? What could the government do that would be more positive than banging on about safety all the time? Some of you, I know, think I keep on ranting on about the fact that we'll never be safe. I know you've heard me say this before, so forgive me, but I bang on about it because it's fundamental to getting us out of this. It seems to me that government scientists and medics have led the government in Britain and many governments in the Western world into a philosophical and political cul-de-sac from which there is no escape. March the 8th won't be safe to open schools. Someone after that will catch COVID-19. Will we have to close the schools down again when that happens? It can't be safe. There's no such thing. Absolute safety is an illusion. So I think the government can do two things: to stop talking about safety as if such a thing exists in the absolute. Here are two suggestions that I think we should take on board, and I think the government should. Firstly, I think there should be genuine empathy. I sometimes wonder if the Prime Minister and the Minister's scriptwriters need a brain transplant. They're dominant stories, robotic statements read from a script. They've got to dredge their souls for an ounce of empathy with real people's suffering. It's not that we keep saying, and we're sad about the number of people who died. Sure, they are. And we know it's hard for parents not being able to get children back in school. That sentence reeks of insincerity. It may not be insincere, but the presentation of it sees parent after parent watching that and shouting at the TV screen. I'm not making this up. This is happening more and more. Saying, you don't understand. You're in some glorious protected environment in which you have a nanny for your children, or they're receiving wonderful online lessons from private schools. You have all this support. We have nothing like that. And there's real anger about the lack of empathy. And so we've got to find a way in our comfort, because many of us listening to this are in wonderfully comfortable situations, truthfully. We have enough food, we have enough shelter, we've got all we need. But for huge numbers of people, this lockdown is creating deep, deep pain. So firstly, government ministers and public figures and ordinary women and men like us have got to find empathy for thousands, millions, around the world, it really is millions, of people in pain. And do what the incarnation of Jesus does, where he came from heaven and put himself in our place. Experience the limitations of humanity. We've got to learn to do that for others. And secondly, night by night, we've got to find stories on the television, in the mainstream media and in social media of the suffering of lockdown. Let me read you the kind of story from an A&E doctor this week. And I think this story, and one like it, needs to be on our news every night. And whenever the Prime Minister and his cohorts stand up in front of us, these stories ought to be repeated in the same way that stories about deaths from COVID or suffering are being repeated. Because it is crystal clear to me that this pain is real. So this is a direct quote from an A&E doctor. "I'm horrified," he says, who spent a week in a mental health A&E. "I'm horrified at the effect lockdown is having, particularly on the poor. A young woman recently sat in my outpatients clinic and asked me to take her children away. She was calm, and at first I thought she was joking. 'Why?' I asked. She simply couldn't cope anymore. Then as she began to sob, she confessed she was worried she'd end up killing them, and then herself. 'I love them so much,' she repeated as she begged me to take them into care. You have to be pretty desperate to try and give your children away. She lived in 2 rooms and shared a bathroom and a kitchen with another family. One child had autism, the other behavioural problems and developmental delay. She has no family in this country. Day in and day out, she sat in the room while her children screamed and wailed. I sat blinking at her, literally speechless. There were no day centres, no drop-ins, all sacrificed in the rush to lock down. She hadn't seen her social worker for months. In the pandemonium of the pandemic, her community mental health team had effectively shut up shop and left her without any support. How she has lasted this long, I have no idea. It's easy for people in big houses having Zoom cocktails with their family to claim they know what's best and insist that restrictions are imposed, which means others are going stark, staring mad. Now listen, I want that story and a story like it and suicidal tendencies and mental health issues on the news every single night. Because in order to get out of lockdown, people need to understand the pain of it, not just the pain of the very real, by the way, the very tragic deaths from COVID-19, but the need for balance in reporting and presentation. Because unless we learn to live with risk, unless we learn to live with this, we're going to be stuck forever in a cycle of lockdown or restriction. We have to learn to take risks and to measure those risks, and the population of Britain and the world need to understand with some gruesome reality the stories of lockdown pain. It's fine for the BBC particularly has been outrageous in some of its broadcasting. The media is fine to go into a COVID ward with all its horror. Fancy that revealing some of the intrusion of the camera work and the pain of people suffering from COVID. Of course it's real, but it feels like COVID pornography. As we look at the suffering and the death that's been caused, it needs to be balanced by the suffering and pain that's being caused elsewhere. And so this sense of being trapped is real for people. So may God bring us victory through the vaccine, of course. May it be rolled out and take the vaccine, have it as soon as you're offered it. It's not going to be perfect, but it is a really positive step in the right direction. So have the vaccine, sign up for it, make sure that you get it as soon as you can. But the hope of deliverance from this feeling of trappedness, the setting free from jail, as we saw in the biblical references, are determined really by our faith in a God who intervenes, and how desperately we need him to do that. How urgent our prayers need to be. Isaiah 43, this is a God who is with us. But now this is what the Lord says. He who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I've summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. I have summoned you by name. They won't sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, and the flames will not set you ablaze. So God is with us. And the prayer that we need to pray is in Isaiah 64. Here it is, a wonderful, wonderful prayer. Isaiah 64, it's a cry of the heart. We can no longer treat all this with a kind of glib, okay, we'll get through it together, wartime spirit thing. We need a new desperation for God to intervene. Isaiah 64 verse 1, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains would tremble before you. And so we need that sense that God is with us, that in times of great darkness, his presence is real, and more than that, that cry to God to set us free. Now, I want to read something to you. I'm going to ask my lovely assistant to pass me the piece of paper that she's sitting on, and then I'm going to read to you something which will bless the hearts of the people from Liverpool. In 1945, Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote a musical. It's called Carousel. In it, one of the characters, Billy, after a bodged burglary job, not a very nice character, takes his own life by falling on a dagger or a sword. A suicidal, tragic death. His wife, Julie, is abandoned and feels broken, and this song was written in order to give her some hope in the trappedness of a life without her husband now. And the song goes, walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. How many of us have feel that our dreams in the last year have just disappeared? Our dream of travel, our dream of a future education, our job, all that we hoped for just disappeared. Maybe it'll return, maybe it won't. We don't know. Walk on, and with hope in your heart, you'll never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. And when you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. And at the end of the storm is a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind. Walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. With hope in your heart, you'll never walk alone. And though that song, a secular song written rich with sentimentality, the hope in our hearts for those of us who feel trapped, there is a hope. It's the hope in God's presence, Isaiah 43, and it's the hope of divine intervention, Isaiah 64. So this week, look out for someone who's trapped and try and help them in whatever way you can. But whatever you do, whatever we do, let's pray for God to rend the heavens and come down and get us out of this mess, because in the end, only